Okay, then we're back again. Introduction to Geopolitical Risk, Part 3. It's been too long. The first two parts were quite long, so I will be fairly brief in this last part, but I'll say a little bit about the formalities of the course. But first, on the reading list for today in the course information, which you have to read and familiarize yourself with, I have specified some readings for today. It's some easy to read newspaper articles really, from The Economist and Financial Times. But they raise some issues which are part of, what I will talk about in this and what you will learn about in this course. I'll very briefly go through them. What I've said earlier is that it's the same that, some of these newspaper articles refer to, that the post-Cold War period from the early 1990s was a period characterized by relative geopolitical stability relative to, earlier periods like the Cold War and the Second World War, the First World War. I mean, throughout history, most, periods over 20 years are characterized by geopolitical instability, by wars, etc. and by economic difficulties and instability and disagreements among the major powers and rivalry among the major powers. That was not really the case in the post-Cold War period, in the first couple of decades there. Geopolitical stability, booming markets in general. And the geopolitical change that did happen, the major things were positive. Of course, the Cold War ended, and then you open up markets in Eastern Europe, in Russia itself, in a lot of countries that used to have relatively closed economies. And you had the expansion of the US zone of influence, you had the expansion of the European Union, and you had relatively clear and agreement among the major powers on the rules of the game: capitalism, market-based economies, economic globalization, relatively free trade, in most areas at least, and investment across borders. And now you have, more difficulties, more stumbling blocks. You had the re-emergence of nationalism, of geopolitical rivalry, and there are specific causes linked to that, which will be a topic for this course and this lecture series. And of course, markets fear geopolitics. Big geopolitical things, rivalries, wars, diplomatic conflicts, it has an impact. And so these are some of the messages from this, as I said, easy to read news sources. And then one of these articles, The Economist from 2014, The Economist is a newspaper, weekly newspaper that analyzes and writes about events in international, and they contribute with analysis of the international economy, international politics. And they refer to Deutsche Bank's risk analysis, a study, which is kind of characteristic for some of these issues in this course as well. And in fact, in other courses, I co-teach actually a master course this fall, which is called The Rise and Decline of Great Powers, which is kind of historically focused. And this is exactly what Deutsche Bank is referring to here, and what other people are referring to as the kind of root source for a lot of these issues and developments. The rise and fall of the world's leading power, meaning in this case the US, the relative fall or decline. It doesn't have to be dramatic, but the US is in decline because other countries are rising economically. And this is an issue I will return to several times. The main contender as a consistent major driver of significant structural change in global levels of geopolitical tensions is the rise and fall of the world's leading power. In general, we would argue that periods of single superpower world dominance have been times of relative structural geopolitical stability, whilst times of equal and competing great powers have been times of structurally high geopolitical instability. So if you have several great powers, each competing for their position, status, and influence in the international system, then you will get increased tension, is the argument here. And history has shown that the argument carries some weight. Whereas if one country leads, clearly leads, like the US did in the 1990s and the first decade of the new century, the new millennium. When the US leads, it calls the shots, and it doesn't really matter that much that other countries might be dissatisfied with the rules of the game, the economic rules, you know, the division of territory, the share of influence different countries has over other countries. It doesn't really matter, because if one state is so much bigger, stronger, mightier, their economy is bigger than others, then that country calls the shot and can, you know, shape the environment in its own image. And it can create a certain level of stability. And this is what we know from other eras, like 2,000 years ago when the Romans governed Europe, essentially, and created stability, and Northern Africa. They governed much of Europe, Northern Africa. It was the Roman sphere. And the Romans, they thrived and they wanted, of course, stability within their empire. And they were militarily mighty. And they quashed, you know, most of the internal uprisings and created, you know, an environment where the economy could blossom. You know, it's 2,000 years ago, so it's basically not the same complex economies we have today. But the Romans governed and kept really a high level of stability for several hundred years. They were clearly the mightiest power. They weren't in the beginning, you know, the Punic Wars against Carthago, and they had other military conflicts, and you had a turbulent period. But then when the empire, the Roman Empire, was established finally, then you had several centuries of relatively high stability and prosperity. Same was true with the United Kingdom from the late 18th century, but in particular from the golden period in the 19th century, where the British ruled the world, or ruled the sea, the waves. Which essentially meant that other countries, other actors had to be, you know, had to defer to the British. The British were militarily, in terms of their fleet, they were strongest by far in the 19th century, before their decline. And they were economically the strongest for a long time, until things started to change in the late 19th century and other countries grew. And then you have the decline of the great power or the greatest power, the so-called hegemon of the system. And other countries are rising, and then you get tensions and you get rivalry, and you end up essentially in World War I in 1914. But the same argument can be used for, what we call the Pax Americana, the Pax Romana, Roman peace, Pax Britannica, the British peace, and then the American peace, which is partly a phenomenon from the end of the Second World War for a large part of the globe. But then you had this rivalry with the Soviet Union, so it was really a US partial hegemony, a partial Pax Americana. But then you had the end of the Cold War, and then you had the real version of Pax Americana. You had stability, globalization, you had the US pushing for other countries to become, their economies to become market-based. You have a push for American companies to be allowed into different and into new investment areas and so forth. And you have a lack of great power rivalry, because in the 1990s, for instance, you had only one great power. That was the US. Russia was nothing. They had domestic problems after, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They had enormous economic problems, actually, and they had social problems, and you had a lowering of living standards. You had a lowering of life expectancy, and militarily they also pretty much collapsed. So they were not a factor. Suddenly they went from being, one of the two superpowers to being nothing. And in the 1990s, China was nothing, relatively speaking. China was weak economically. China was weak militarily. So you don't get this tension between these bigger powers. You get a war here and there, and you get smaller tensions, but nothing like the level of the Cold War, the Second World War, the interwar period, the First World War. There's a lot of, it's not a straightforward argument. There's a lot of nuances that can be made. But it's quite a common argument that if you have one hegemon, there's a theory that is called, the hegemonic stability theory, which argues that due to several causes, if you have one big power, then you get more easily stability, less rivalry, and more commerce. When you have peace and stability, trading becomes easier, risk becomes low. So that's an argument that runs through some of these articles. But another thing that runs through these articles is, of course, that things are starting to change. And this is from 2014. You had the Ukraine crisis, which was really a sort of a harbinger for things to come, a symbol of things are changing. Russia is back. They're taking parts of Ukraine. And they're not deterred by, the US or by European countries. They're invading and annexing Crimea. Back in 2008, Russia had a first taste of this, foreign, post-Cold War foreign intervention. They went to war against Georgia. For much of the same reasons why they entered into Ukraine, by the way. And so for me, 2008 is really both for the reason of Russia's comeback and for the reason of Chinese, growth and ambitions and specific, conflicts and behavior, Chinese behavior in Asia. For these reasons, I tend to take 2008, 2009 as, symbol that you have these new big powers, Russia coming back, China coming back like they were several hundred years ago, as really a power, a state to be reckoned with. But then you have, people point to other things, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the way it probably led to a lack of legitimacy for the capitalist, the free trade or the capitalist system shaped by the U.S. and these Western countries. Laissez-faire, typical, let the market sort itself out. It didn't work well in 2008, 2009. There was nothing like a collapse of the system, but strains and stresses. And some of these articles on the readings, they emphasize, a couple of these articles emphasize the stresses to the system. And then you have other things, the pretty much failed interventions, invasions that the US did in Afghanistan and Iraq that raises the barrier for similar interventions. And that means that other actors get more, room for maneuver. And you can end up actually getting less stability and more rivalry because the US is pretty much self-deterred from entering into other areas. There's a counter-argument, of course, as well, that these US military adventures are creating instability almost automatically, so we shouldn't really want the US to act as a regional or world policeman. But anyway, I'm referring to these arguments from the readings here. You had the rise of partisan politics in the US, which predated the run-up to the 2016 elections. Now we know that the partisanship, the split within the political establishment, split between the political parties in the US is really clear-cut. And then you had the rise of China, the biggest thing of all the big things, I would say, in international politics. And Deutsche Bank, they reckon that these geopolitical tensions which happened then in 2014 over Ukraine, and it involved Russia, it involved the EU through economic sanctions, and it involved the US through economic sanctions, and increased military presence in the eastern part of Europe. Deutsche Bank argues that, or indicates that, these are really not only temporary stresses and tensions, these are structural. And these are long-term. And markets might have to price in a higher degree of geopolitical risk in the years ahead. And I fully agree with that assessment. And this will be part of the running story of this lecture series. And another article refers to Brexit and a reminder that impossibles may turn into improbables and then quickly become fact, as I refer to the black swan principle or concept, which will be a topic for next lecture, I think it is. Brexit is sudden, it happens. Very few people think they would really leave the EU, and then they leave the EU. Political turmoil has returned after decades of tranquility and calm. And then, of course, one thing can lead to another, and they point to the scope for vicious cycle. If things just start, reversing, if tensions increase and you get higher tariffs, you get more geopolitical risk, companies invest less, then they earn less, profits go down, workers are laid off, you get more nationalism, more insecurity for people, more protest, more instability, which in turn decreases profits, increases geopolitical risk, and etc. That's also an argument that is really geared toward warning that one may often be too complacent. Optimism may sometimes be too widespread. And many people, and business leaders are in particular susceptible to be optimists. They're almost selected. It's part of, they have to be optimists. They're capitalists. They have to believe in the future, in profits, and we know from earlier times and the run-up to the First World War, which I will also return to later in the lecture series, is the prime example of widespread optimism. Nobody, almost, in the business community in the early summer of 1914 thinks that these European states will start attacking each other. And you have one article on the reading list that analyzes this period and the businesses and financial markets in the run-up to that war and other wars. And the optimism was so widespread that when things started happening in July and in particular in August 1914, these business leaders were taken completely by surprise. They didn't think that prosperity could end and people and states could start attacking each other, but that is exactly what happened. But that is a dramatization of the general argument that complacency and optimism is necessary for the wheels to turn and for capitalism. It's almost the basis for capitalism. If we fear the future, we stop buying things, and then businesses don't earn as much as they used to. They had to lay off workers, which earn then less because they don't get the wages they used to. And this is, one of these vicious cycles that may happen. And the economists and many people are not particularly impressed with what they call cosmopolitan elites. The really rich people that govern these biggest companies, and they earn a lot, and they live in their own sort of bubble, and an optimistic bubble where globalization will last forever. So this is part of the discussion in some of these contributions. And the Financial Times piece also deals with some of these issues. The optimism in the post-Cold War concerning the question of American leadership, American hegemony, the European project, the EU project. And the argument that, when countries trade that much with each other, they become interdependent, which makes conflict, rivalry, and war more costly, which in turn then, theoretically at least, should reduce the incentives and likelihood of rivalry and in particular war. But that piece in the Financial Times argues really the opposite, that the world has changed, and businesses should pick up on that sort of fact that things are less predictable than before, dangerously unpredictable. One might disagree with the wording here, and one shouldn't over-dramatize these things. But if there's money to be made in calculating geopolitical risk, there is money to be saved in understanding it. So that's really the end words of the introduction part, and I hope people have a sense of what kind of topics that are discussed here. And I hope you read with interest some of or all of these things on the required readings. I will now also very briefly talk about some of the practical stuff. And of course I know many of you, most of you, all of you are really focused often on the exam, and as a professor or lecturer, I'm not really interested in the exam, but I'm interested in the process. I want you to enjoy and be interested in this process where you read and you reflect and you take notes, you reread. Sometimes you even listen to lectures. The readings are always the most important part. You have to internalize the things, but the exam, of course, is important feels important at least. This is not the biggest exam of them all, and it's the grade has in practice little effect on anything in this world. But anyway, it's a take-home exam, and that's due to the uncertainties about the coronavirus situation. So you get a 5-hour take-home exam based on required readings in lectures. On Blackboard I posted one previous exam. It was from this spring, a retake sort of exam. That's the only take-home exam that has been given in this course. I'll get back, of course, I don't have the date for the exam as yet. I'll get back to that. The exam is based on required readings and lectures. And then we have the term papers, and that's three short ones. With a deadline Sunday 11th of October, it's a pass, no pass. This is a requirement for taking the exam, and it has no bearing on the final grade. Most will pass, so it's not a case of, I want people to do this requirement to enjoy doing it, because I think most people learn a lot, and I think most people, even if it's stressful, it's a learning process, and it's interesting, and you can choose your own subjects. And the point here, and I'll deal with this next time, because next time I will walk you through these risk analysis by a firm, political risk analysis firm called the Eurasia Group, one of the largest geopolitical risk analysis firms, which helps businesses and other actors actually to understand the geopolitical world, so they can either avoid risks or mitigate or alleviate risks, or earn money for that matter. And they have this yearly report which they publish in January, and they state that these are the 10 biggest things to watch for in 2020, for example. So you have on the required readings their yearly report. Actually, you have two versions of it, because the Eurasia Group, after a couple of months, they published another updated one due to the coronavirus situation. So they took the risks they had reviewed, and they interacted them with the new situation, the new developments. But I'll get back to that next time, because I'll walk you through the two reports. You're supposed, the short version of it, and I'll give a longer version next time, and we'll talk about it later in more interactive way. But the clue here is that you're supposed to act like an employee of Eurasia, which means that and the background you have, political scientist, or if you're a historian, or if you study business or economics, you can end up, doing some consultancy or risk analysis or something similar. And some students, they actually end up in political risk analysis business. Some end up in things that have to, that is related to that geopolitical risk analysis business. And so many of you will end up in your work life writing such reports on politics, not necessarily international political developments, but politics or things that has to do with society. Short pieces that clearly lays out the fundamentals, the essentials of a problem or a phenomenon. That is your task, to act as employees of Eurasia Group, act as analysts of Eurasia Group, and write the report for next year. What you think we should watch out for, 3 important things that you yourself think we should watch out for next year. So it's a fun exercise. It's fairly demanding, of course it should be, but it's a fun exercise. All of you will get feedback on this. I have a teaching assistant that will carefully read each of these, and together we'll discuss these contributions as well, and she will write you a feedback eventually. And then you have some required readings, and you find that on Blackboard. I posted it there. You have a lot of journal articles, you have book chapters, and I provided a link to this electronic compendium concerning book, including book chapters. And you have some reports, not journal articles, but reports. For instance, you have to read a couple of chapters in the Statoil, the so-called In Amenas report after the terrorist attack against Statoil back in 2013. There was a big, report assessing what went wrong. Did Statoil analyze the risks and, in a good enough way? And you have a couple of other such reports, and then the news articles for today. It's just, a small handful of pieces. There aren't really any books on the market that I'm fully satisfied with when it comes to, I shouldn't have too much readings. And so in the course information, description, I've listed a few books which you can, if you're interested, buy or loan at the library. But I found it a good way to proceed to keep some flexibility, to have shorter pieces, journal articles, and so you don't have any books. You have a few book chapters, but not any full books on the readings. And then lastly, and very briefly, the lecture plan today. Introduction to geopolitical risk. Next time I'll deal with black swans, as I say, from a theoretical and empirical viewpoint, and geopolitical forecast. And that's really about the Eurasia Group report, and I'll talk a bit about that. Then we move over for 2 lectures to security risks and terrorism, which is kind of a separate area, extremely relevant for many companies in many areas, and very interesting. And then we have more on, the way to govern economies, way to structure economies. Should the state intervene? Should the market decide, market forces? These are ideologies or theories, depending on, often there's a mix between the explanatory and the normative dimensions of these viewpoints. And then in lecture 6, I'll speak about Pax Americana, the US role and the US way of shaping the international system, and the future and the relative decline how important is that? How fast will it go? What are the effects? So we'll devote one lecture to that. Then we'll deal with geopolitics in a more traditional way, war, rivalry between big powers, and the effects those things have on international business. For 3 lectures then, I'll take the geoeconomics dimension, which is really the use of economic means by states to shape their external environment. Economic sanctions, for instance, is a clear-cut geoeconomic tool. The US uses its power, economic power, instead of military power. In many cases, uses its economic power to punish certain countries or companies from certain companies or companies that invest in certain companies, and thereby the US is able, in at least in many instances, to shape the strategies of businesses and sometimes countries as well. But there's more to that than economic sanctions. You have tariff policies, you have a lot of economic strategies that can function geopolitically to increase your relative power or to reach your objectives. And then we have one lecture about maritime conflicts with a special focus on the South China Sea, although the Eastern Mediterranean is as I indicated, a running case now, which is tense and interesting. And then the last lecture will, look in the crystal ball and look into the crystal ball and speculate or predict what will happen in the future in terms of these trends. So this was really a long first lecture divided into 3 parts. I'll look it over and I'll learn from my stumbling and mistakes, and I'll get some technological or digital input from experts at the department, and I'll improve. This is my first digital lecture ever. So I'll see you pretty soon. Okay, take care and bye-bye.